The Tightwad Gazette has many ideas for saving money. The idea that I was looking for today was how to save money on coffee. And there are a few ideas how to save money on coffee. One is to switch brands and purchase coffee with a coupon. Another is you make your coffee go farther by reusing your coffee grounds with half as much fresh grounds added to the old ones. And another is you decide to drink half as much of coffee. After I was reading the Tightwad Gazette, I was thinking how I could save money on coffee. My current coffee cup holds 12 ounces, and the new coffee cup that I'm using holds 10 ounces. So I was thinking if my coffee cup is smaller, then I might be able to use less coffee. So this is how I make a cup of coffee. I'm using this pour over kind of contraption, and I'm using a reusable coffee filter, and I will be sure and put a link in the description below on how I make my own coffee filters. And for the coffee, what I'm using is 1 tablespoon of coffee. And with my previous coffee cup, I was using 2 tablespoons. And I've tried to reduce the amount of coffee that I used in my other coffee cup, but it was just way too weak. So for some reason, just using a smaller coffee cup and half of the coffee grounds makes for a satisfying cup of coffee. For today's project, I am going to sew some reusable coffee filters. And this is a pattern that I've used quite a few times. And on the pattern itself, it says that it is 10.5. But that's not entirely accurate. It's slightly bigger than 10.5 inches. But that size seems to work pretty good for my purposes. And the fabric is an unbleached muslin. I believe it's 100% cotton. The unbleached just makes sense for me because you're just going to be pouring coffee and water into it, so you don't want a whole lot of dyes. So I'm going to cut out probably about 4 of these coffee filters, just so I have a few. A couple of the filters that I had got coffee grounds into them, so I'm going to alter the way that I sew up the next bunch of filters. Now that I've got my fabric cut out, what I'm going to do is fold it in half and try to line up the ends the size as much as possible. But it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to fix that in a second. And then fold it over once more again. And again, just trying to line it up as good as possible. And now what I'm going to do is pin the sides. And I think I'm going to start from the bottom. And I'm going to start pinning about an inch from the bottom. Okay, and my cone coffee filter actually has a flat bottom. So what I'm going to do next is just take a snip of the bottom there, just to give it a flat area, just so it'll lay right. Before I start sewing, I'm going to even up some of the ends. For some reason, even though the circle that I have the pattern for looks pretty round, it seems like I always need to just even out the ends. So what I'm going to do is just take a pair of scissors, and now that everything is pinned up, I'm going to just even out some of the ends. And turning it over just to see how everything is looking. It's almost looking good again. Okay, now that that work is done, I am going to start sewing up the ends with a whip stitch. And for my thread, I found a thread that I think matches pretty well to the fabric, pretty close to the color that I'm using. And when I buy fabric, I usually buy thread at the same time, just to make sure it's a good match. So this is the fabric, the thread that I'm using. And I got this at Joann Fabrics. Usually they've got a pretty good selection. And the whip stitch, I think, is the most basic stitch. One of the most basic stitches for hand sewing. I think it's a really good beginner kind of stitch. And so this is the stitch that I'm going to be using to sew up the ends. And when I'm finished with this, I will be back to work on a straight stitch on the bottom to just kind of give it an extra bit of reinforcement. For the whip stitching around the edges here, I ended up making 3 passes just to make sure there was plenty of structure and support. And then I stopped about 1 inch on this end, just to make it easier for the stitching that's going to happen up there. And in addition, I'm also going to do a straight stitch across. And I think it's always a good idea to mark where you're going to stitch. I think it just makes it a lot easier. So your stitching isn't crooked, and you're sure you're staying with all the other stitching that has come before it. And to mark this stitching, I'm using a
a marking pencil. Usually I use a white marking pencil, but I tried the white one and it didn't show up at all on this fabric. So blue works best. And the straight stitch is a very simple stitch. I think it's a really good beginner stitch. And I think that I will probably do 3 passes on this as well. Just to be sure it's really got a really good seam. Just because the last thing you want is coffee grounds to end up in your cup, or worse, to get stuck in the folds of the fabric, because there's actually quite a bit of places that coffee grounds could end up during the process. So doing a few extra stitches is certainly a good idea. And I will finish this up. And then I will move on to the top of the project. Now it's time to start folding the rest of this and start stitching up the rim of this coffee filter. Usually I would do a bit of measuring and making sure everything is looking the same. But in this particular case, I think just folding down the fabric just as small as you can is really the way to go. And I'm going to just continue folding. And then when I'm done, I'm going to do a whip stitch on this piece of the project. Now that I'm done with the pinning, I'm ready to start the whip stitching. And as you'll see, this is the reason why I stopped about 1 inch from the end here. It just makes it easier to fold down this fabric without running into this bit of stitching there. So the whip stitch is going to be just a very tiny little stitch that we're just going to do all around the ends here. And it's so easy to snag one of these pins. And I'm just straightening out my thread as I go. It will get tangled and it will snag on the pins. But just do it slowly and keep going. Okay, I finished whip stitching all around, and as I'm looking at the edges and how uneven they are, I'm really wishing that I had measured. It's not terribly important because it's a coffee filter, but I'm gonna notice this every time I go and use it for a cup of coffee. So next time I think that I will measure it. And for the last part, we're just gonna sew up the ends here. This little 1 inch that we had to leave in order to sew up the top of it properly. And I do like this project. This is a nice little break from bigger projects. I have projects in mind for skirts and blouses, but this is kind of a fun afternoon kind of project. I would say each of these coffee filters probably takes about an hour or so just to do all the sewing. But it's a nice little break from the bigger projects that because I do all the hand sewing, the bigger projects tend to take about a month or so. But so it's nice to be able to just do a simple project. Being able to cut everything out and do all the sewing and have it completely done within the span of one afternoon. And since I've done this particular project a few times, it's begins to look really familiar, and it's just nice not to have to figure stuff out. So definitely a nice project to kind of break up the bigger projects. And for tying off thread, I like to do it 3 times. I'm not sure if it's for luck or what, but 3 times just seems to be my favorite way to finish off a piece of thread. So at this point, the reusable coffee filter is all done and ready to be used.